In the gleaming towers of Sterling Financial, a seasoned compliance officer was about to challenge the most powerful banking family in the region. What started as a routine merger review took a shocking turn when she came face to face with evidence of systematic money laundering worth over $1 billion. Hannah Caldwell wasn't your typical corporate whistleblower. For 5 years as a federal banking examiner, she had spent her life protecting the financial system from fraud, known for her unwavering moral compass and analytical precision that could detect corruption others missed. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead in the Sterling Financial Compliance Department, casting their sterile glow across Hannah Caldwell's cluttered desk. At 11:47 p.m., she was alone on the 32nd floor, surrounded by towers of documents that represented months of due diligence work on the most significant merger in the bank's history. The $3 billion acquisition of Continental Trust Bank was set to transform Sterling Financial from a regional player into a national powerhouse, and Hannah's final compliance review was all that stood between the deal and federal approval in 72 hours. She rubbed her tired eyes and reached for her third cup of coffee, now cold and bitter. The merger documents stretched across 2 monitors, spreadsheets filled with transaction data that would have made most people's eyes glaze over. But Hannah found comfort in numbers. They didn't lie, didn't manipulate, didn't hide behind charm or political connections. Numbers told the truth, even when people didn't want to hear it. As she scrolled through Continental Trust's client account histories, something caught her attention, a pattern that shouldn't have been there. She leaned forward, her analytical mind immediately engaging with the discrepancy. The transactions were small individually, $9-day $800, $9-day $100, $9-day $100, but their frequency and amounts were suspicious. Each one fell just below the $10,000 threshold that would trigger targeted reporting to federal authorities. Hannah's pulse quickened. She'd seen this before, during her 5 years as a federal banking examiner. Structuring, the deliberate splitting of larger transactions to avoid detection. It was a classic money laundering technique, and finding it in a bank about to be acquired by her employer sent a chill down her spine. She pulled up her father's photograph from her desk drawer, a habit she'd developed whenever work became particularly challenging. James Caldwell smiled back at her from the frame, his kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses unchanged since his death in 2000. He'd lost everything to a Ponzi scheme that had promised impossible returns, leaving behind crushing debt and a daughter who'd sworn to prevent others from suffering the same fate. "What would you do, Dad?" she whispered to the empty office. Hannah knew what he'd do. He'd want her to dig deep. She began cross-referencing the suspicious transactions with federal databases, her security clearance allowing her access to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. What she found made her stomach drop. The accounts were linked to a web of shell companies, registered in the Cayman Islands and Delaware, with ownership structures so complex they seemed designed specifically to obscure the true source of the funds. But that wasn't the worst part. As she traced the money flows, she discovered that similar patterns existed throughout Continental Trust's commercial banking division. Hundreds of accounts, millions of dollars moving through elaborate schemes that had all the hallmarks of sophisticated money laundering operations. Hannah's hands trembled as she reached for her phone, activating the camera. She knew she was crossing a line. Photographing confidential bank documents could end her career, but something deeper than professional obligation drove her forward. This wasn't just about regulatory compliance anymore. This was about protecting the financial system itself. Click. The first document captured. She moved methodically, documenting transaction reports, account summaries, and regulatory filings that should have been flagged years ago. Each photograph felt like a small act of rebellion against the forces that had destroyed her father's life and threatened to destroy countless others. As the night wore on, Hannah's investigation revealed the true scope of the problem. The suspicious activity wasn't limited to Continental Trust. Cross-referencing with Sterling Financial's own records showed similar patterns, though more carefully concealed. Shell companies that existed only on paper. Transactions that followed no logical business purpose. Regulatory reports that had been filed late, or contained obvious errors that somehow escaped scrutiny. She discovered that several of the problematic accounts had been personally approved by Marcus Sterling, the vice president of strategic development, and nephew of CEO Richard Sterling. The signatures were unmistakable, even though Marcus supposedly had no direct involvement in day-to-day banking operations. His approvals had bypassed normal oversight procedures, using emergency authorizations that were meant for legitimate business crises. Hannah felt sick. The merger wasn't just about growth or market expansion. It was a way to absorb Continental Trust's problems and bury them within Sterling Financial's larger balance sheet. The due diligence process had been designed to fail, to overlook obvious red flags in favor of completing a deal that would make certain people very wealthy while exposing the financial system to enormous risk. She thought about her comfortable life, her respected position, her hopes for advancement within the company. 5 years ago, she'd left federal service believing she could make more of a difference working within the private sector. She'd been naive then, thinking that profit motives and regulatory compliance could coexist peacefully. The weight of her discovery pressed down on her like a physical force. Alone in the sterile office, surrounded by evidence of institutional corruption, Hannah felt the isolation that came with unwanted knowledge. She was probably the only person in either bank who both understood the scope of the problem and cared enough to do something about it. Her phone buzzed with a text from her sister Sarah, "Working late again. Don't forget you have a life outside that office." If only she knew, Hannah, if only any of them knew what was happening in the gleaming towers of American finance, where billion-dollar decisions were made by people who viewed regulatory compliance as an obstacle to be overcome rather than a protection to be honored. She saved her work to an encrypted drive and powered down her computer. Tomorrow morning she would have to decide whether to report her findings through proper channels or pretend she'd never seen them. She knew which choice her father would have made, but she also knew the personal cost of challenging powerful interests. Hannah gathered her belongings and headed for the elevator, her mind already racing through the conversation she would need to have with Marcus Sterling in the morning. She didn't yet realize that her discovery had set her on a collision course with forces far more dangerous than she imagined, or that her decision to document the evidence would soon transform her from trusted insider to marked enemy. The elevator doors closed behind her, carrying her down from the 32nd floor toward a future she couldn't yet envision but was already inevitable. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and Hannah stepped into the executive suite at 8:15 a.m., her encrypted drive tucked securely in her briefcase, alongside the printed copies of the most damning evidence. She'd barely slept after leaving the office 6 hours earlier, her mind churning through different scenarios for how this meeting might unfold. In her more optimistic moments, she imagined Marcus would thank her for catching such serious compliance issues before they became public scandal. In her darker thoughts, she feared he already knew about the problems and would see her discovery as a threat rather than an opportunity. The executive floor felt different from her compliance department. Thick carpets muffled footsteps, original artwork adorned the walls, and the morning light streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows that offered commanding views of the city below. This was where power resided at Sterling Financial, where decisions affecting millions of lives were made over expensive coffee and handshake agreements. Marcus Sterling's corner office reflected his privileged position within the family hierarchy. The space was too large for someone with his limited experience, furnished with antiques that spoke more to inherited wealth than earned success. Behind his mahogany desk hung his MBA diploma from Wharton, a constant reminder of credentials that had opened doors his talent never could have unlocked. "Hannah, right on time," Marcus said, barely looking up from his smartphone as she entered. At 29, he carried himself with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his decision. His tailored suit cost more than most people made in a month, and his perfectly styled hair suggested he spent more time on personal grooming than reviewing the documents that crossed his desk. "Thank you for making time for this meeting, Mr. Sterling," Hannah replied, maintaining the professional tone she'd rehearsed during her sleepless night. "I've discovered some concerning irregularities in the Continental Trust merger documentation that require immediate attention." Marcus finally set down his phone, though his expression suggested mild annoyance rather than concern. Irregularities. Hannah, we've been through this process for 8 months. Every document has been reviewed by teams of lawyers and accountants. The deal closes in 3 days. Hannah opened her briefcase and placed a folder on his desk. I understand the timeline, but these issues go beyond routine compliance matters. I've identified patterns of suspicious transactions that appear to be structured to avoid federal reporting requirements. Structured transaction. Marcus's tone shifted slightly, though he maintained his dismissive posture. That's a serious accusation, Hannah. Are you certain you're reading these documents correctly? Banking regulations can be complex, especially for someone without extensive experience in commercial operation. The condescension stung, but Hannah pressed forward. I have 5 years of experience as a federal banking examiner, Mr. Sterling. I know money laundering when I see it. These accounts show clear evidence of structuring, and the beneficial ownership information for many of the shell companies involved is either missing or deliberately obscured. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his fingers drumming against the leather armrest. Shell companies are perfectly legal, Hannah. Many of our largest clients use complex corporate structures for legitimate tax and business purposes. Just because something looks suspicious to an inexperienced compliance officer doesn't mean it's actually improper. I've cross-referenced these transactions with FinCEN databases, Hannah continued, her voice growing stronger despite Marcus's attempts to diminish her credibility. The patterns are consistent with known money laundering schemes. More importantly, I've found similar activity in some of Sterling Financial's own accounts that were personally approved by you using emergency authorization procedures. The change in Marcus was immediate and unmistakable. His casual arrogance evaporated, replaced by something harder and more calculating. He leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Hannah with new intensity. What exactly are you implying, Miss Caldwell? I'm not implying anything, Hannah replied, meeting his. I'm stating that you personally approved transactions that should have triggered enhanced due diligence and federal reporting requirements. These approvals bypassed normal oversight procedures and appear to facilitate the very type of suspicious activity I've identified at Continental Trust. Marcus stood and walked to his window, his hands clasped behind his back. When he turned around, his expression had hardened into something resembling his uncle's calculating demeanor. Hannah, I think you're misunderstanding the nature of executive decision-making in a complex financial institution. Sometimes unusual situations require expedited approvals to serve our clients' legitimate needs. The regulatory requirements you're citing are guidelines, not absolute rules. They're not guidelines, Hannah said firmly. They're federal law, and facilitating money laundering is a criminal offense that could result in prosecution for both individuals and institutions. Are you threatening me? Marcus's voice carried a dangerous edge now, the pretense of casual authority replaced by something more primal. Because it sounds like you're suggesting that I've committed crimes, which is a very serious accusation to make against a senior executive of this bank. Hannah felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain calm. I'm fulfilling my professional obligations as a compliance officer. These irregularities must be reported to federal authorities before the merger can proceed. The potential liability exposure alone, the merger will proceed as scheduled. Marcus interrupted. This bank has invested too much time and resources in this deal to let some junior compliance officer derail it with half-baked conspiracy theory. I'm not junior, Hannah said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay professional. And these aren't theories. If you're not willing to address these concerns through proper channels, I'll have no choice but to report them directly to the Federal Reserve and Marcus walked back to his desk, his movements deliberate and controlled. That would be a career-limiting decision, Hannah. This bank values loyalty above all else. Employees who demonstrate that loyalty are rewarded, those who don't. He let the threat hang in the air. Are you asking me to ignore evidence of potential criminal activity? Hannah asked, her father's photograph flashing through her mind. Because that's not something I'm willing to do. I'm asking you to remember who signs your paychecks, Marcus replied coldly, and to consider whether you're really prepared for the consequences of making unfounded accusations against this institution and its leadership. Hannah stood, her briefcase clutched tightly in her hand. If that's your final position, then I have no choice but to escalate this matter to federal authorities. I took an oath to protect the integrity of the financial system, and I intend to honor it. Marcus reached for his phone. Robert, yes, I need you to come to my office immediately. We have a personnel issue that requires your attention. He hung up and looked at Hannah with cold satisfaction. Miss Caldwell, effective immediately. Your employment with Sterling Financial is terminated. You'll be escorted from the building by security, and any attempt to access bank systems or facilities will be considered trespassing. You can't fire me for reporting compliance violations, Hannah said, though her voice wavered with shock. I can fire you for insubordination, making false accusations against senior management, and attempting to damage the bank's business relationships, Marcus replied smoothly. Your final paycheck will be mailed to your home address. The office door opened and Robert Kane entered, a tall, imposing man with the bearing of his law enforcement background. His cold eyes assessed Hannah with professional detachment. Miss Caldwell's employment has been terminated, Marcus told Kane. Please escort her from the building, and ensure she returns any company property. As Kane approached, Hannah realized that everything had changed in the span of a 20-minute conversation. She was no longer a trusted insider working to protect the institution. She was now an enemy, armed with dangerous knowledge, and facing opponents with resources she was only beginning to understand. But as Kane reached for her briefcase, Hannah clutched it tighter. Her evidence was her lifeline now, the only protection she had against forces that would stop at nothing to complete their corrupt deal. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, sometimes doing the right thing cost everything. Hannah's hands shook as she fumbled with her apartment keys, the humiliation of being escorted from Sterling Financial still burning in her chest. Robert Kane had watched her every move as she cleared out her desk, his cold presence a constant reminder that she was no longer welcome in the place where she'd spent 5 years building her career. The security cameras had tracked her journey to the elevator, and she'd felt the stares of former colleagues who whispered behind their hands as she passed. But she still had her briefcase. In the confusion of her termination, Marcus had been so focused on getting her out of the building that he'd forgotten to confiscate the evidence she'd gathered. The encrypted drive and printed documents represented her only leverage now, the proof that could validate everything she'd tried to tell him. Her apartment felt smaller than usual, the modest one-bedroom space that had seemed perfectly adequate for a successful compliance officer now highlighting her sudden unemployment. She set her briefcase on the kitchen table and stared at her father's photograph, which she'd managed to retrieve from her desk drawer before Kane had hurried her along. What now, Dad? She whispered to the empty room. The answer came from her own memories of his advice during her federal banking examiner days. When the system fails, find someone outside the system who still believes in justice. Hannah pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts until she found the name she was looking for, Jennifer Wall. They'd worked together at the Federal Reserve 5 years ago, before Jennifer had left in frustration over what she called regulatory capture, the phenomenon where the Yankees meant to oversee banks became too cozy with the institutions they were supposed to regulate. The phone rang 3 times before Jennifer's familiar voice answered. Hannah Caldwell, I heard through the grapevine that you'd gone over to the dark side of private banking. How's life as a corporate sellout treating you? Despite everything, Hannah managed a weak smile. Jennifer's cynical humor had always been her defense mechanism against the disappointments of federal service. Not well, actually, Jen, I need to see you. It's important. How important? Because I'm in the middle of reviewing a client's regulatory filings, and unless Sterling Financial is about to collapse, it can wait until Sterling Financial might actually be about to collapse, Hannah interrupted, along with Continental Trust Bank. Jen, I've found evidence of massive money laundering operations, and when I tried to report it, they fired me. The line went quiet for a moment. Jesus, Hannah, are you serious? Dead serious? Can we meet somewhere private? I have documentation, but I need someone who understands federal banking law to help me figure out how to present this to the right people. My office in an hour, Jennifer said, her tone shifting to pure business. And Hannah, don't talk to anyone else about this until we've had a chance to review what you've found. If you're right about this, you're going to need all the protection you can get. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jennifer Walsh's consulting firm occupied a modest suite in downtown's financial district, far from the gleaming towers where the major banks conducted their business. The waiting room was sparse but professional, decorated with framed articles about financial reform and regulatory enforcement. Hannah had always appreciated Jennifer's directness. She was someone who said exactly what she meant, regardless of whether people wanted to hear it. "You look like hell," Jennifer said by way of greeting, her sharp green eyes taking in Hannah's rumpled appearance and obvious stress. At 45, Jennifer had the weathered look of someone who'd fought too many battles against entrenched interests, her graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, and her suit more functional than fashionable. "I feel like hell," Hannah admitted, following Jennifer into her office. "Jen, what I'm about to show you, it's worse than anything I saw during my federal examiner days." Jennifer poured 2 cups of coffee from a machine that had seen better days. "Start from the beginning. Tell me everything." Hannah spent the next 30 minutes walking through her discoveries, laying out the documents while Jennifer asked pointed questions about transaction patterns, regulatory compliance procedures, and the specific nature of the offshore accounts. As a former federal investigator, Jennifer understood the implications immediately. "Shit," Jennifer muttered, studying a particularly damning transaction report. "This isn't just money laundering, Hannah. This is systematic institutional corruption." "How long has this been going on?" "Based on the account histories, at least 3 years," Hannah replied. "But here's the really disturbing part. I think the merger with Continental Trust is designed to bury these problems. Sterling Financial absorbs Continental's dirty operations, dilutes them across a larger balance sheet, and suddenly everything becomes much harder to trace." Jennifer leaned back in her chair, her expression grim. "And Marcus Sterling fired you when you tried to report this." "Fired me and had security escort me out like I was some kind of criminal," Hannah said, her anger flaring again at the memory. "Jen, his signature is on dozens of these problematic accounts. He's not just covering this up, he's actively facilitating it, which means his uncle Richard knows about it too." Jennifer said thoughtfully, "The Sterling family doesn't take risks like this without careful planning. They've been building this bank for 30 years. They wouldn't jeopardize everything, unless they were confident they could control the outcome." "What do I do?" Hannah asked. "I tried to work within the system, and they destroyed my career in 20 minutes. How do I fight people with that kind of power?" Jennifer was quiet for a moment, studying the documents spread across her desk. "First, you need to understand that you're not just fighting Sterling Financial anymore. You're fighting a system that has powerful incentives to ignore problems like this. The merger creates jobs, generates tax revenue, and makes a lot of important people very wealthy. Your evidence threatens all of that. So I should just give up?" "Hell no," Jennifer said firmly. "But you need to be smart about this. Going directly to federal regulators is the right move, but you need someone who can't be bought or intimidated. Someone with a track record of standing up to bank pressure." She pulled out her phone and scrolled through her contacts. "Sarah Reynolds. She's a Federal Reserve examiner who specializes in merger oversight. Lost her previous position a few years ago when she refused to approve a questionable deal, but she was reinstated after a whistleblower lawsuit. If anyone will take your evidence seriously, it's Sarah." "What about public pressure?" Hannah asked. "If federal regulators can be influenced, maybe exposing this publicly would force them to act." Jennifer nodded approvingly. "Now you're thinking like someone who wants to win this fight. I know a journalist who specializes in financial crime reporting. David White at the Financial Tribune. He's brought down corrupt executives before, and he has the resources to investigate this properly. Will he believe me? I'm just a fired compliance officer making accusations against one of the city's most prominent banking families." "He'll believe the evidence," Jennifer said, tapping the documents. "And Hannah, you're not just a fired compliance officer. You're a former federal banking examiner with 5 years of experience and an impeccable reputation. Your credibility matters." Jennifer stood and walked to her window, looking out at the financial district where the real power brokers operated. "I won't lie to you about what you're facing. The Sterling family has connections throughout the regulatory system, political influence, and unlimited resources. They'll try to destroy your reputation, question your motives, and make you doubt yourself. They've already started," Hannah said quietly. "But you have something they don't," Jennifer continued, turning back to face her. "The truth. And once that truth gets out, once federal investigators start looking seriously at these transactions, the whole house of cards starts to fall. Hannah felt a spark of hope for the first time since her confrontation with Marcus. So what's our next move? We document everything, prepare a comprehensive presentation for Sarah Reynolds, and get David White started on his investigation, Jennifer said. And from this point forward, you're not alone in this fight. I've been waiting 15 years for someone to bring me evidence this solid against institutional corruption. I'm not letting them bury you or this story. For the first time in hours, Hannah felt like she could breathe again. The system had failed her, but there were still people within it who cared about justice more than politics. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York stood like a fortress among the financial district's glass towers, its limestone facade and iron gates, reflecting an era when banking regulation carried real weight. Hannah climbed the steps beside Jennifer Walsh, her briefcase containing copies of evidence that could potentially bring down one of the region's most powerful financial institutions. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was returning to federal service, not as an employee, but as a whistleblower, seeking protection from the very industry she'd once hoped to reform from within. Sarah Reynolds met them in the building's austere lobby, her government identification badge, a stark contrast to the expensive suits and designer accessories that dominated Sterling Financial's executive floor. At 52, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived political purges and bureaucratic warfare, her graying hair and minimal makeup suggesting someone more interested in substance than appearance. "Ms. Caldwell," Sarah said, extending a firm handshake. "Jennifer briefed me on the general nature of your concerns. I understand you have evidence of regulatory violations related to the Sterling Financial Continental Trust merger, evidence of systematic money laundering operations that should disqualify the merger entirely," Hannah replied, grateful for Sarah's direct approach. "The transaction patterns suggest both institutions have been facilitating illegal financial activities for years." Sarah led them through security checkpoints and up to her office, a functional space that reflected federal budget constraints rather than private sector excess. Charts showing banking merger timelines covered one wall, while filing cabinets filled with regulatory documents occupied most of the available floor space. "Before we begin," Sarah said, settling behind her desk, "I want you to understand the gravity of what you're alleging. If your evidence supports criminal activity, this matter will move beyond regulatory oversight into federal law enforcement jurisdiction. Are you prepared for that level of scrutiny?" Hannah thought of her father's photograph still sitting on her kitchen table beside the evidence that had cost her career. "Ms. Reynolds, my father lost everything to financial fraud I became a banking examiner to prevent others from suffering the same. If that means criminal prosecutions, then yes, I'm prepared." Over the next 2 hours, Hannah walked Sarah through her discoveries, explaining transaction patterns, while Jennifer provided regulatory context and legal interpretation. Sarah asked detailed questions about compliance procedures, documentation protocols, and the specific nature of the offshore account structures. Her federal examiner background was evident in her methodical approach to evaluating evidence. "These transaction amounts are clearly structured to avoid CTR filing requirements," Sarah said, studying a particularly damning account summary, "and the beneficial ownership information for these shell companies is either missing or deliberately obscure." "That's what caught my attention initially," Hannah explained, "but when I started cross-referencing with Sterling Financial's own accounts, I found similar patterns. The merger isn't just about business expansion, it's about absorbing and concealing Continental Trust's problematic operations." Sarah's expression grew increasingly grave as she reviewed the documentation. "The regulatory filings for this merger make no mention of enhanced due diligence for suspicious account activity. If Sterling Financial's executives were aware of these issues and failed to disclose them, that's a material omission that would void federal approval." "Marcus Sterling was definitely aware," Hannah said. "His signature appears on emergency authorization forms for dozens of suspicious accounts. When I confronted him with the evidence, he fired me rather than address the compliance violations." "Terminated for reporting regulatory violations?" Sarah asked, her tone sharpening. "That's potential retaliation against a whistleblower, which carries serious federal penalty." Jennifer leaned forward, Sarah, based on your experience with merger oversight, what's our timeline here? The deal is supposed to close in 48 hours. Sarah was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the implications of what she'd heard. Under normal circumstances, I'd recommend additional due diligence and extended review periods, but given the scope of potential violations you've documented, I think we're looking at emergency intervention. She reached for her phone. I'm calling Director Morris. If these allegations are substantiated, we need to halt the merger approval process immediately. Hannah felt her pulse quicken as Sarah spoke in measured tones to her superior, explaining the need for an emergency review of the Sterling Financial merger documentation. The conversation was brief but intense, punctuated by long pauses as Sarah answered questions about the evidence and Hannah's credibility. Understood, sir, Sarah said finally. I'll prepare a preliminary assessment within 2 hours. She hung up and turned back to Hannah and Jennifer. The director is initiating an emergency hold on merger approval pending our review. Sterling Financial will be notified within the hour that federal approval has been suspended. What happens next? Hannah asked, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. We conduct a full investigation, Sarah replied. I'll need additional documentation from both banks, and will likely bring in specialists from FinCEN to review the suspicious transaction pattern. If our findings support your allegations, we'll refer the matter to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. 25 miles away in Sterling Financial's executive suite, Richard Sterling's phone buzzed with an encrypted message from his contact at the Federal Reserve. The merger approval had been suspended pending review of newly discovered compliance concerns. Richard's hands clenched around the device as he read the brief message twice, his carefully controlled expression revealing nothing of the fury building inside him. He walked to his office window, looking out at the city where he'd built his empire through 3 decades of calculated risks and strategic relationships. The Sterling name carried weight in financial circles, political networks, and regulatory agents. He'd cultivated those relationships carefully, understanding that success in banking required more than just financial acumen. It required the ability to influence the people who made the rules. Marcus burst into his office without knocking, his face flushed with panic. Uncle Richard, the Fed just called. They're suspending the merger approval. They mentioned compliance concerns and additional review requirements. I know, Richard said calmly, though his mind was already calculating response strategies. Tell me exactly what happened with Hannah Caldwell. Marcus shifted uncomfortably. She came to me with some suspicious transaction reports, making accusations about money laundering and regulatory violations. I explained that she was misinterpreting normal business operations, but she threatened to go to federal authority. So you fired her, Richard said, his voice carrying dangerous undertones. I had to, Marcus replied defensively. She was threatening the merger with unfounded allegations. I thought removing her would contain the situation. Richard turned from the window, his calculating gaze fixed on his nephew. You thought wrong. Firing a compliance officer who raises legitimate concerns creates exactly the kind of attention we've spent years avoiding. He reached for his phone and dialed Robert Kane's direct line. Robert, we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. Hannah Caldwell has become a problem that needs to be managed. Understood, sir. Kane's voice came through the speaker. What level of management are we discussing? Whatever it takes to protect this institution, Richard replied, but remember, we're dealing with a former federal examiner who probably understands witness protection protocols. She won't be easily intimidated. As Richard hung up, he was already planning his next move. The federal investigation would require political intervention, regulatory pressure, and careful damage control, but first, they needed to discredit Hannah Caldwell before her allegations gained more credibility. The war for Sterling Financial's survival had begun, and Richard Sterling intended to win it regardless of the cost. Hannah first noticed the black sedan 3 blocks from her apartment building, its tinted windows reflecting the afternoon sun as she walked home from her meeting with David White at the Financial Tribune. The investigative journalist had been intrigued by her story, promising to begin his own investigation while she worked through official channels. But now, as she turned onto her street and saw the same vehicle parked across from her building, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the October weather. She quickened her pace, her hand instinctively reaching for her phone. Jennifer had warned her that corporate retaliation could escalate quickly once federal authorities became involved, but Hannah hadn't expected it to begin so soon. The Federal Reserve's suspension of the merger approval had been announced just 6 hours ago. Her apartment felt different when she unlocked the door, not obviously disturbed, but somehow wrong in ways she couldn't immediately identify. The stack of mail on her kitchen counter seemed slightly rearranged. Her laptop, which she'd left closed on the coffee table, was now positioned at a slightly different angle. Small details that could have been her imagination, but her federal examiner training had taught her to trust her instincts about surveillance. Hannah carefully examined her apartment, looking for signs of entry or hidden devices. She found nothing obvious, but the feeling of violation persisted. Someone had been here, searching through her personal space with professional skill that left minimal trace. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Ms. Caldwell, we need to discuss your recent activities. Meet me at Morrison's Cafe on 5th Street in 1 hour. Come alone. R. Kane, Robert Kane, Sterling Financial's head of security, the man who'd escorted her from the building yesterday. Hannah's hands trembled as she read the message again. This wasn't a request. It was a summons backed by the implicit threat of escalation if she refused. She called Jennifer, who answered on the first ring. Hannah, how did your meeting with David White go? Someone's been in my apartment, Hannah said quietly, moving to the window to check the street below. The black sedan was still there, and Robert Kane wants to meet with me. Jen, I think they're trying to intimidate me into backing down. Don't meet with him, Jennifer said immediately. Kane's a former police detective who handles Sterling Financial's dirtiest problems. If he's reaching out directly, it means Richard Sterling sees you as a serious threat. What if I don't show up? What if they escalate? Then we document everything and report it to Sarah Reynolds, Jennifer replied. Hannah, corporate intimidation of federal whistleblowers is a serious crime. Every threat they make just adds to the evidence against them. Despite Jennifer's advice, Hannah found herself walking toward Morrison's Cafe 40 minutes later. She needed to understand what Sterling Financial was planning, and Kane might reveal more than he intended. She'd positioned her phone to record audio, tucked safely in her jacket pocket. Morrison's was a small establishment, favored by financial district workers, its cramped tables and worn decor reflecting its function as a place for quick meetings rather than leisurely dining. Kane sat in a corner booth, his imposing presence making the space feel even smaller. At 55, he carried himself with the disciplined bearing of his law enforcement background, his cold gray eyes assessing Hannah as she approached. Miss Caldwell, he said, not bothering to stand, thank you for coming. Please, sit down. Hannah remained standing. Mr. Kane, I should tell you that any attempt to intimidate a federal whistleblower is a serious crime. Kane smiled, but the expression held no warmth. Intimidate? I'm simply here to discuss your future prospects and suggest some alternatives that might be beneficial for everyone involved. I'm listening, Hannah said, sliding into the booth across from him while keeping her body language defensive. You've had a distinguished career in financial compliance, Kane began, his tone conversational but his eyes never leaving her face. 5 years as a federal examiner, 5 years in private sector compliance. Impeccable reputation, well respected by colleagues, no history of disciplinary action or questionable judgment. What's your point? My point is that it would be unfortunate if that reputation were to become complicated by unfounded allegations against respected financial institutions. Kane leaned forward slightly. Careers can be fragile things, Miss Caldwell. One poorly substantiated accusation, one investigation that finds no wrongdoing, and suddenly potential employers start questioning your judgment, your motives, your reliability. Hannah felt her anger rising. Are you threatening my career prospects? I'm simply observing that the financial industry is relatively small, Kane replied smoothly. People talk, reputations. A compliance officer who makes dramatic accusations that can't be proven might find it difficult to find employment in the field again, and if the accusations can be proven, Kane's expression hardened almost imperceptibly, that would be unfortunate for everyone involved. Sterling Financial has been a pillar of this community for 30 years. We employ over 3,000 people, contribute millions in tax revenue, and support countless local businesses. It would be a shame if one person's misinterpretation of complex financial documents were to damage something so important to so many people. Mr. Kane, are you asking me to withdraw my allegation? I'm suggesting that you might want to reconsider whether you've interpreted the evidence correctly, Kane said. Complex financial institutions engage in sophisticated transactions that might appear unusual to someone without extensive experience in commercial banking operations. Perhaps a second review of the documentation might reveal more innocent explanations for the patterns you've identified. Hannah stood up, her phone still recording in her pocket. Mr. Kane, I know money laundering when I see it, and I know that firing a compliance officer for reporting violations is illegal retaliation. Kane remained seated, his calm demeanor unchanged. Ms. Caldwell, I hope you'll take some time to carefully consider your position. The financial industry can be a rewarding career for those who understand how to work constructively within established systems. It can be much less welcoming to those who choose confrontation over collaboration. Is that a threat? It's simply an observation about professional dynamics, Kane replied. But I would encourage you to think carefully about the long-term consequences of your current course of action, not just for your career, but for your personal well-being and peace of mind. Hannah felt a chill at the subtle menace in his words. My personal well-being. Kane stood, his impressive height making the small cafe feel even more confined. The stress of prolonged legal proceedings, media attention, and professional uncertainty can take a serious toll on a person's health and happiness. It would be unfortunate if you were to put yourself through such an ordeal for a cause that ultimately proves unsuccessful. He placed a $20 bill on the table and moved toward the exit. I trust you'll give serious consideration to what we've discussed, Ms. Caldwell. Sterling Financial values problem-solving over problem creation. I hope you'll choose to be part of the solution. After Kane left, Hannah sat in the cafe for another 10 minutes. Her hands shaking as she replayed the conversation. The threats had been subtle but clear. Her career, her reputation, and potentially her personal safety were all at risk if she continued pursuing her allegation. But as she walked home, passing the same black sedan that was now following her at a discreet distance, Hannah thought about her father's photograph and the promise she'd made to prevent others from being victimized by financial fraud. Robert Kane had underestimated her resolve. If Sterling Financial wanted a fight, she was prepared to give them one. Amanda Sterling stared at her computer screen in the Continental Trust Bank compliance department, the cursor blinking impatiently in the search field as she hesitated to enter the account numbers she'd discovered in her brother's hastily discarded note. At 25, she'd always lived in Marcus's shadow despite being the more academically gifted sibling, watching him stumble upward through the family business, while she worked 60-hour weeks to prove herself worthy of the Sterling name. The notes had fallen from Marcus's briefcase during his panicked visit to Continental Trust that morning, scattered across the conference room floor as he'd ranted about disloyal employees and federal overreach. Amanda had quietly collected the papers while he'd argued with Continental's executives about the merger suspension, her analytical mind immediately recognizing the account numbers and transaction patterns detailed in his frantic handwriting. Now alone in her cubicle during the lunch hour, she faced a choice that could destroy everything she'd worked to build. The account numbers in Marcus's notes corresponded to some of Continental Trust's most sensitive commercial relationships, clients whose complex transaction patterns had always made her uncomfortable but which senior management had assured her were perfectly legitimate business operations. She typed in the first account number. The transaction history that populated her screen made her stomach clench. Hundreds of deposits just under the $10,000 reporting threshold, funds flowing through a maze of shell companies registered in jurisdictions known for banking secrecy. The patterns were textbook examples of structuring, the deliberate splitting of larger transactions to avoid federal detection requirements. Amanda had studied money laundering detection during her finance degree, had written papers on the regulatory frameworks designed to prevent exactly this type of activity. Seeing it in her own bank's systems, protected by the institution that bore her family's name, felt like discovering a cancer in her own body. She printed the transaction reports, her hands trembling as the pages emerged from the department printer. Each document was another piece of evidence that her family's business empire was built on corruption, that the merger her uncle and brother were so desperate to complete was designed to bury criminal activity rather than create legitimate growth. The worst part was realizing she'd unknowingly facilitated some of these transactions. Her signature appeared on several approval forms, authorizing wire transfers she'd assumed were routine business operations. Senior management had assured her that the complex ownership structures were standard practice for international clients seeking legitimate tax optimization. "Amanda, you're working through lunch again." She spun around to find Thomas Mitchell, Sterling Financial's general counsel, standing behind her cubicle. His usually composed demeanor seemed strained, his expensive suit unable to hide the tension in his shoulders or the dark circles under his eyes. "Mr. Mitchell," she said, quickly minimizing her computer screen, "I was just reviewing some client files." Thomas glanced around the nearly empty compliance department, then pulled up a chair beside her desk. "Amanda, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you noticed anything unusual about certain account activities lately? Anything that might have caught the attention of federal regulators?" Amanda felt her pulse quick. Thomas Mitchell had been with Sterling Financial for 20 years, rising through the ranks based on competence rather than family connections. If he was asking these questions, it meant the legal problems were more serious than Marcus had indicated. "What kind of unusual activities?" she asked carefully. Thomas was quiet for a moment, studying her face with the careful attention of someone trained to read people's reactions, the kind that might prompt someone to contact federal authorities about compliance violations. "Are you asking if I know anything about the federal investigation?" Amanda said, deciding that directness was her safest approach. "I'm asking if you've seen anything that might explain why a compliance officer would make allegations serious enough to halt a $3 billion merger." Thomas replied, "Because if such evidence exists, it's better that the family knows about it before federal investigators uncover it themselves." Amanda looked at the printed transaction reports hidden beneath a stack of routine files on her desk. Thomas Mitchell was offering her a chance to be loyal to her family, to help them prepare for whatever legal challenges lay ahead, but he was also giving her an opportunity to understand the full scope of what she'd discovered. "Mr. Mitchell, if someone had evidence of regulatory violations, what would happen to them, to the person who reported it? I mean," Thomas's expression grew grave, "that would depend on whether they were seen as a problem to be managed or a threat to be eliminated. Corporate whistleblowers face significant risks, Amanda: retaliation, intimidation, career destruction. Even when they're ultimately vindicated, the personal cost can be devastating. But if the violations were real, if there was genuine criminal activity, then reporting it would be the right thing to do," Thomas said quietly. Regardless of the personal consequences, Amanda made her decision. "Mr. Mitchell, I need to show you something, but first, I need to know, are you here as Sterling Financial's lawyer, or as someone who cares about preventing criminal activity?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his internal struggle evident in his expression. Finally he spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "Show me what you found." Amanda pulled out the transaction reports, spreading them across her desk while Thomas examined each document with the careful attention of someone trained to spot legal liabilities. His face grew increasingly pale as he reviewed the evidence. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "How long has this been going on?" "Based on these account histories, at least 3 years," Amanda replied. "And Mr. Mitchell, these are just the accounts mentioned in Marcus's notes. I think there might be more." Thomas sat back in his chair, looking like a man who'd just learned he was terminally ill. "Amanda, do you understand what this means? If federal investigators find this evidence, it's not just regulatory violations we're talking about. This is criminal conspiracy, money laundering, potentially racketeering charges." "I know," Amanda said. "The question is, what do we do about it?" Thomas was quiet for several minutes, weighing options that all carried terrible consequences. "There's a compliance officer named Hannah Caldwell who was terminated yesterday for reporting similar violations. She's working with federal authorities to investigate the merger. You want me to contact her? I want you to think very carefully about your next steps. Thomas said. Because once you provide evidence to federal investigators, there's no going back. Your family will see you as a traitor, your career in banking will probably be over, and you'll spend years dealing with legal proceedings and media attention. Amanda thought about her father who died when she was 16, believing that the Sterling name represented integrity and community service. She thought about the depositors and investors who trusted Continental Trust with their financial security, unaware that their money was being used to facilitate criminal enterprises. Mr. Mitchell, how do I contact Hannah Caldwell? Thomas pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. There's a journalist named David White at the Financial Tribune who's been investigating this story. He can put you in touch with Ms. Caldwell safely. Amanda copied the contact information, her hands steadying as she committed to her course of action. Will you help? Will you provide additional documentation if federal investigators request it? Thomas looked at the evidence spread across her desk, then at Amanda's determined expression. I've spent 20 years building my career at Sterling Financial, but I won't spend the rest of my life knowing I helped cover up criminal activity. He stood and straightened his tie, transforming back into the composed legal professional who'd navigated corporate crises for 2 decades. Amanda, if anyone asks, we never had this conversation, and whatever you decide to do, be very careful. Your uncle and brother will do whatever it takes to protect themselves. As Thomas walked away, Amanda began organizing the evidence she would soon turn over to federal authorities. She was about to betray her own family, but for the first time in her life, she felt like she was truly living up to the Sterling name her father had believed in. The Federal Reserve Bank's conference room had witnessed countless high-stakes negotiations over the decades, but the emergency session convened at 2:00 p.m. on Thursday carried an electricity that even veteran regulators found unsettling. The mahogany table that had hosted discussions about interest rates and monetary policy now bore the weight of documents that could bring down one of the region's most prominent financial institutions. Hannah sat between Jennifer Walsh and her newly assigned federal attorney, facing a panel of regulators whose expressions ranged from grave concern to barely concealed anger. Across the table, Richard Sterling commanded an army of expensive lawyers, their tailored suits and leather briefcases a stark contrast to the government-issued furniture and fluorescent lighting that dominated the federal building. Sarah Reynolds called the session to order, her voice carrying the authority of 15 years in federal banking oversight. This emergency review has been convened to examine allegations of material misrepresentations in the proposed merger between Sterling Financial and Continental Trust Bank. Ms. Caldwell, please present your findings to the panel. Hannah stood, her hands steady despite the magnitude of the moment. The last week had transformed her from institutional insider to federal witness, and she'd learned to channel her nervousness into focused determination. Honorable regulators, the evidence I'm presenting today demonstrates systematic money laundering operations at both Sterling Financial and Continental Trust Bank, facilitated through complex offshore account structures designed to circumvent federal reporting requirements. She activated the presentation screen displaying transaction patterns that told a story of deliberate criminal activity. These accounts show clear evidence of structuring transactions deliberately split to remain below the $10,000 CTR filing threshold. The beneficial ownership information for the associated shell companies is either missing or deliberately obscured through jurisdictions known for banking secrecy. Richard Sterling's lead attorney, a sharp-featured woman in her 50s named Catherine Reeves, immediately objected. Ms. Reynolds, my client objects to these inflammatory characterizations. Complex commercial banking relationships often involve sophisticated transaction structures that may appear unusual to inexperienced compliance personnel but are entirely legitimate business operations. Ms. Caldwell was a federal banking examiner for 5 years, Sarah Reynolds replied coolly. I think she's qualified to recognize suspicious transaction patterns. Hannah continued her presentation, walking through account histories that demonstrated the scope of the money laundering operation. The merger documentation filed with federal authorities makes no mention of enhanced due diligence for these suspicious accounts. Sterling Financial's executives were aware of these compliance issues, but chose to conceal them rather than address them. That's a serious allegation, said Director Morrison, the senior Federal Reserve official who'd authorized the emergency review. Do you have evidence of executive knowledge?
Yes, sir.
Hannah displayed copies of authorization forms bearing Marcus Sterling's signature. Vice President Marcus Sterling personally approved emergency authorizations for dozens of these problematic accounts, bypassing normal oversight procedures designed to prevent exactly this type of activity. A murmur rippled through the Sterling financial legal team, and Hannah noticed Richard Sterling lean forward to whisper urgently to Catherine Reeves. His carefully controlled composure was beginning to crack under the weight of documented evidence. Furthermore, Hannah continued, when I attempted to report these violations through proper channels, I was immediately terminated in what appears to be illegal retaliation against a federal whistleblower. Catherine Reeves stood abruptly. Reynolds, my client disputes these characterizations entirely. Ms. Caldwell was terminated for insubordination and making unsubstantiated accusations against senior management. Sterling Financial has operated in full compliance with all applicable regulations for 30 years. Then you won't object to our enhanced review of the transaction records Ms. Caldwell has identified, Sarah Reynolds said. We'll need complete documentation for all accounts mentioned in this presentation, along with beneficial ownership information for the associated shell companies. Some of that information may be protected by client confidentiality. Catherine began. Federal banking regulators have broad authority to access client records during investigations of potential criminal activity. Director Morrison, interrupt. Sterling Financial will provide full cooperation or face immediate regulatory sanctions. The conference room door opened, and Hannah turned to see David White enter with a young woman she recognized from news coverage as Amanda Sterling. The journalist's presence sent another ripple of tension through the room, while Amanda's appearance seemed to drain the remaining color from Richard Sterling's face. Miss Reynolds, David White said, I apologize for the interruption, but we have additional evidence that directly corroborates Ms. Caldwell's allegations. This is highly irregular, Catherine Reeves protested. This is a federal regulatory proceeding, not a media circus. Mr. White is here as a representative of the public interest, Sarah Reynolds replied. And Miss Sterling, I believe you work for Continental Trust Bank. Amanda stepped forward, her voice trembling but determined. Yes, ma'am. I'm a junior analyst in Continental Trust's compliance department. I have documentation that supports everything Ms. Caldwell has presented today. The silence that followed was deafening. Richard Sterling stared at his niece with a mixture of shock and betrayal, while Marcus, who had been sitting quietly beside his uncle, looked like he might be physically ill. Amanda, Richard said, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. I think you're confused about your loyalties and your obligations to this family. I'm not confused, Amanda replied, her voice growing stronger. I know the difference between family loyalty and criminal conspiracy. She placed a folder on the conference table. These are transaction reports from Continental Trust accounts that show the same patterns Ms. Caldwell identified. The money laundering operations aren't limited to Sterling Financial. They extend throughout both institutions. Director Morrison examined Amanda's documents while the Sterling Financial legal team huddled in urgent consultation. Ms. Sterling, are you prepared to testify under oath about these findings? Yes, sir, Amanda replied without hesitation. Richard Sterling stood slowly, his carefully constructed facade finally cracking completely. This is unconscionable. My own family member manipulated by disgruntled employees and opportunistic journalists into betraying the institution that provided her education, her career, her entire future. Uncle Richard, Amanda said quietly. You provided my education so I could distinguish between right and wrong. That's exactly what I'm doing. Sarah Reynolds called for a brief recess to allow the regulatory panel to review the new evidence. As the room emptied, Hannah found herself face-to-face with Richard Sterling, who had dismissed his legal team and approached her directly. Miss Caldwell, he said, his voice carrying 30 years of institutional authority. You have no idea what you've unleashed. Sterling Financial employs over 3,000 people, supports countless community organizations, and contributes millions in tax revenue. Are you prepared to destroy all of that based on your misinterpretation of complex financial documents? Miss Sterling, Hannah replied, meeting his intimidating gaze. I'm prepared to prevent your bank from facilitating criminal activity. regardless of the consequences. The consequences will be severe, Richard said coldly. For you, for my naive niece, and for everyone who's chosen to stand against this institution. Is that a threat? It's a promise, Richard replied. This merger will proceed. These allegations will be proven baseless, and everyone involved in this attack on Sterling Financial will face the full consequences of their action. As Richard Sterling walked away, Hannah realized that the emergency meeting had accomplished more than just presenting evidence to federal regulator. It had drawn clear battle lines for a conflict that would determine whether institutional corruption or individual courage would ultimately prevail. The real war was just beginning. The emergency Federal Reserve meeting had concluded with a formal suspension of the merger and the announcement of a comprehensive criminal investigation. Within hours, Richard Sterling's carefully constructed empire began showing cracks that 30 years of strategic relationship building couldn't repair. But desperate men with unlimited resources rarely surrendered without exhausting every available weapon, and Richard Sterling had spent decades accumulating leverage over people who could still influence the outcome. His first call went to Senator Patricia Walsh, whose banking subcommittee had received substantial campaign contributions from Sterling Financial over the year. The conversation took place on a secure line from his private office, away from the federal surveillance he now assumed was monitoring all bank communications. Patricia, I need a favor, Richard said without preamble. The Federal Reserve is conducting what appears to be a politically motivated investigation into Sterling Financial. I'm concerned that overzealous regulators are exceeding their authority and threatening legitimate business operations. Senator Walsh's response was cautious. Richard, I've heard rumors about money laundering allegations. If there's substance to these claims. There's no substance, Richard interrupted. This is about a disgruntled employee making unfounded accusations after being terminated for insubordination. The regulatory response has been completely disproportionate to the actual evidence. What exactly are you asking me to do? Call Director Morris. Express your concerns about regulatory overreach and the economic impact of halting legitimate business mergers based on unsubstantiated allegations. Remind him that the banking industry employs thousands of constituents in your state. The line was quiet for a moment. Richard, I can't interfere with an active federal investigation. If these allegations are baseless, the investigation will prove that. Patricia, Sterling Financial has been a loyal supporter of your political career for over a decade. I'm simply asking you to ensure that federal regulators are acting within appropriate bounds. I'm sorry, Richard. I can't help you with this. The call ended abruptly, leaving Richard staring at his phone with growing fear. Political influence that had taken years to cultivate was evaporating as elected officials distanced themselves from potential scandal. He needed more direct action. Robert Kane entered the office without knocking, his expression grim. Sir, we have problem. FBI agents are interviewing bank employees, and several compliance staff members are cooperating with federal investigators. The Justice Department has frozen assets associated with the suspicious accounts. What about Hannah Caldwell? Under federal protection, Kane replied. They moved her to a safe house after our last conversation. Direct approach is no longer viable. Richard walked to his window, looking down at the city where his influence had once seemed unshakable. Robert, this bank has survived 3 recessions, multiple regulatory changes, and countless competitive challenges. I won't let it be destroyed by one stubborn compliance officer and my naive niece. Sir, the federal investigation is expanding. They're requesting documents going back 5 years. And they're bringing in FinCEN specialists to analyze transaction patterns. The evidence Ms. Caldwell provided appears to be substantiated. Then we need to control the narrative, Richard said, turning back to Kane. Contact our media relations firm. I want a comprehensive campaign highlighting Sterling Financial's community contributions, our employment numbers, and the economic impact of this regulatory overreach. Kane's expression remained skeptical. Sir, with respect, media manipulation won't address criminal charges. If federal prosecutors find evidence of money laundering conspiracy, they won't find evidence if key witnesses become unreliable, Richard interrupted coldly. Hannah Caldwell's credibility depends on her reputation as a competent professional. If that reputation were to be questioned, sir, attacking a federal witness could constitute obstruction of justice. I'm not suggesting anything illegal, Richard replied smoothly. I'm simply observing that people's professional reputations can be complex, employment histories, performance evaluations, previous judgments, all subject to different interpretation. While Richard Sterling plotted damage control, David White was putting the finishing touches on an investigative article that would expose the broader scope of Sterling Financial's operation. His research had uncovered connections between the bank's suspicious accounts and money laundering investigations in 3 other states, suggesting a criminal enterprise far larger than Hannah's initial discoveries had indicated. "This is bigger than we thought," David told his editor over the phone. "Sterling Financial isn't just facilitating money laundering. They're operating as a hub for criminal organizations across the Southeast. The Continental Trust merger was designed to expand their capacity for illegal activity." "How solid is your sourcing?" Hannah Caldwell's evidence is corroborated by federal banking records, Amanda Sterling's documentation from Continental Trust, and confidential sources within both institutions. We also have on-the-record statements from former Sterling Financial employees who left due to compliance concerns. "When do you want to publish?" "Tomorrow morning," David replied, "before Sterling Financial can mount a more aggressive defense campaign." The article would hit newsstands in 12 hours, but Richard Sterling had resources that moved faster than press deadlines. His call to Thomas Mitchell was brief and direct. "Thomas, I need you to file a motion challenging Hannah Caldwell's credibility as a witness. Question her motives, her professional competence, her interpretation of the evidence." "Mr. Sterling, I can't ethically file motions I know to be frivolous," Thomas replied. "Miss Caldwell's evidence appears to be accurate, and her professional reputation is impeccable." "Thomas, you've been with this bank for 20 years, your children's college tuition, your mortgage, your retirement, all dependent on Sterling Financial's continued success. I trust you'll remember where your loyalties lie." The threat was implicit, but clear. Thomas Mitchell faced the same choice that had confronted Hannah Caldwell: personal security versus professional integrity. But unlike Hannah, Thomas had family obligations that made the decision more complex. "I'll review the legal options," Thomas said finally. "You'll do more than review them," Richard replied. "You'll execute them. Sterling Financial's survival depends on discrediting the witnesses against us." As Thursday evening gave way to Friday morning, the battle lines were clearly drawn. Federal investigators were building a criminal case based on documented evidence of money laundering operations. Hannah Caldwell and Amanda Sterling had provided testimony that corroborated systematic violations of banking regulation. David White's article would soon expose the scandal to public scrutiny. But Richard Sterling wasn't finished fighting. Corporate survival had taught him that the most dangerous battles were fought in the shadows, where public accountability couldn't reach. He had one final weapon that could still change the outcome, even if deploying it meant crossing lines he'd never crossed before. Robert Kane's phone buzzed with an encrypted message. "Implement contingency protocol, full authorization grant." Kane read the message twice, understanding its implications. Richard Sterling had just authorized actions that would transform a regulatory investigation into something far more dangerous. The gloves were coming off, and the personal safety of everyone involved was no longer guaranteed. Hannah Caldwell had wanted to prevent others from being victimized by financial fraud. She was about to discover that some victories came with prices she'd never imagined paying. The pre-dawn raid on Sterling Financial began at 5:47 a.m. on Friday morning, as federal agents armed with search warrants and accompanied by forensic accountants streamed through the bank's marble lobby. Hannah watched from across the street, flanked by her federal protection detail, as 30 years of Richard Sterling's empire building faced the systematic scrutiny of criminal investigation. FBI Special Agent Marcus Rodriguez had briefed her an hour earlier from the secure facility where she'd spent the last 3 days. "Miss Caldwell, your evidence provided the foundation for everything we're executing today. The Justice Department has authorized arrests for conspiracy, money laundering and obstruction of justice, were moving on multiple targets simultaneously. Hannah felt a mixture of vindication and apprehension as she watched federal agents escort Sterling Financial employees from the building, their faces pale with shock and confusion. She'd wanted to prevent financial crime, but seeing the human cost of her decision, innocent employees losing their jobs, families facing uncertainty, a community institution under siege, made her question whether the price of justice was worth paying. Miss Caldwell, Agent Rodriguez said, approaching her position near the federal surveillance van, "We need you to identify key personnel as they're brought out. Your insider knowledge of the bank's operations is crucial for ensuring we arrest the right people." Through high-powered binoculars, Hannah watched as Robert Kane emerged from the building in handcuffs. His cold composure finally cracked as he faced federal agents who weren't intimidated by his reputation or connection. The sight of Sterling Financial's security chief being read his Miranda rights felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. "Kane was attempting to destroy evidence when we apprehended him," Rodriguez explained, shredding documents related to offshore account management and client beneficial ownership information. That's additional obstruction charges on top of the conspiracy allegations. Marcus Sterling appeared next, flanked by 2 FBI agents and looking like he might vomit from stress. His expensive suit was wrinkled, his perfectly styled hair disheveled from what had clearly been a sleepless night. Hannah felt an unexpected pang of sympathy for the young man whose entitlement and insecurity had set this entire chain of events in motion. "Is he cooperating?" Hannah asked. "Singing like a canary," Rodriguez replied with grim satisfaction. "Marcus Sterling is providing detailed information about the money laundering operations in exchange for reduced charges. Turns out nepotism doesn't inspire loyalty when federal prison becomes a possibility." The biggest prize emerged 40 minutes later. Richard Sterling walked out of his own bank, surrounded by federal agents, his head held high despite the handcuffs around his wrists. Even in defeat, he carried himself with the arrogance of someone who'd spent decades believing he was untouchable. His eyes swept the crowd of media and federal personnel until they fixed on Hannah's position across the street. Even at that distance, Hannah could feel the intensity of his hatred. Richard Sterling had built an empire through calculated risks and strategic manipulation, only to see it destroyed by a compliance officer who'd refused to look the other way. The expression on his face promised that their conflict wouldn't end with his arrest. "Mr. Sterling is facing significant federal charges," Rodriguez said, following Hannah's gaze. "Money laundering conspiracy, bank fraud, violation of the Bank Secrecy Act, and obstruction of justice. Even with the best Beale representation money can buy, he's looking at 20 years minimum." David White's article had hit the newsstands an hour before the arrests began. Its front-page headline reading, "Billion-Dollar Banking Conspiracy Exposed. Federal Investigation Reveals Systematic Money Laundering Operations." The article detailed not just Hannah's discoveries, but the broader network of criminal activity that Sterling Financial had facilitated across multiple states. "The public response has been overwhelmingly supportive," Jennifer Walsh told Hannah over the phone. "Editorial boards are praising your courage, and other whistleblowers are coming forward with information about similar activities at other institutions. You've started something much bigger than exposing one corrupt bank." But Hannah's attention was focused on Amanda Sterling, who emerged from Continental Trust Bank's offices looking exhausted but determined. As Richard Sterling's niece, Amanda faced the additional burden of family betrayal accusations, but her cooperation with federal investigators had provided crucial evidence that strengthened the entire case. "How is she holding up?" Hannah asked Rodriguez as they watched Amanda speak with federal agents. "Better than expected," he replied. "Miss Sterling has provided extensive documentation about Continental Trust's operations, and she's agreed to testify in all criminal proceedings. Her insider knowledge of both banks makes her an invaluable witness." "What about retaliation?" "The Sterling family has resources and connections. Federal witness protection protocols are in place for all cooperating witnesses," Rodriguez assured her. "Though I suspect the Sterling family will be too busy with their own legal problems to focus on revenge." Thomas Mitchell's arrest came as a surprise to Hannah, who'd hoped the conflicted general counsel might escape prosecution. But his attempt to file frivolous motions challenging witness credibility had backfired spectacularly when federal investigators discovered his knowledge of the money laundering operations extended back several years. Mitchell was caught between impossible choices, Rodriguez explained as they watched the lawyer being escorted to a federal vehicle. Loyalty to his employer versus legal and ethical obligations. Unfortunately for him, he chose wrongly. By noon, the immediate drama of arrests and raids had given way to the longer-term process of building criminal cases. Hannah found herself in a federal building conference room, reviewing evidence with prosecutors who would be responsible for ensuring convictions in what was already being called the largest banking fraud case in the region's history. Ms. Caldwell, your willingness to come forward has prevented potentially billions of dollars in additional money laundering activity, said Assistant U.S. Attorney Sarah Chen, the prosecutor leading the case. The Sterling financial investigation has already led to related cases in 4 other states, and we're coordinating with international authorities to pursue the offshore components of the conspiracy. What happens to the bank employees who weren't involved in criminal activity? Hannah, Sterling Financial employed over 3,000 people. The bank will likely be placed under federal receivership while investigators determine which operations can continue and which must be shut down, Chen replied. Innocent employees will be protected, and depositors' funds are insured. But Sterling Financial as an institution will probably not survive this scandal. Hannah thought about her former colleagues, compliance officers, tellers, loan officers, and administrative staff who'd worked honestly within a corrupt system. Their lives were being disrupted because she'd chosen to expose the truth rather than remain silent. Ms. Caldwell, Chen continued, I want you to understand that your decision to become a whistleblower has protected countless potential victims of financial crime. The money laundering operations, Sterling Financial facilitated funded drug trafficking, human trafficking, and other serious criminal enterprises. By exposing this conspiracy, you've potentially saved lives. As the afternoon wore on, Hannah received updates on the broader impact of the Sterling Financial investigation. Continental Trust Bank had voluntarily suspended operations, pending federal review. Other regional banks were conducting internal audits to ensure they weren't facilitating similar activities. Regulatory agencies were implementing enhanced oversight procedures for future merger reviews, but the personal cost was becoming clear as well. Hannah's career in banking was effectively over. No financial institution would hire someone who'd brought down a major competitor regardless of the justification. She faced years of legal proceedings, media attention, and the psychological burden of having destroyed an institution that had been central to her community for 3 decades. What do I do now? She asked Jennifer Walsh, as they sat in the federal building cafeteria watching news coverage of the day's events. You rebuild, Jennifer replied simply. Not the same life you had before, but something better, something that honors the choice you made to put integrity above personal security. Hannah looked at her father's photograph, which she'd carried with her throughout the ordeal. James Caldwell smiled back at her from the frame, his eyes holding the same quiet determination that had driven his daughter to expose the truth regardless of personal cost. She'd kept her promise to prevent others from being victimized by financial fraud. The price had been higher than she'd ever imagined, but as she watched federal agents loading boxes of evidence from Sterling Financial's offices, Hannah knew she'd made the right choice. The system had tried to silence her, but sometimes individual courage was enough to change everything. 6 months after the Sterling Financial scandal broke across national headlines, Hannah Caldwell stood in the modest office space she'd rented in downtown's revitalized warehouse district, watching movers arrange furniture that would house her new compliance consulting firm. The space was a far cry from Sterling Financial's gleaming executive floors, but it represented something more valuable than luxury, the freedom to practice her profession according to her own moral compass, rather than corporate priority. The morning sun streamed through large windows that faced east toward the financial district, where the former Sterling Financial building now bore the logo of a federal receivership agency. The 32-story tower that had once symbolized regional banking power stood as a monument to the consequences of institutional corruption. its marble lobby and executive suites occupied by federal administrators, liquidating assets and protecting depositor interests. Ms. Caldwell, a young woman's voice interrupted her contemplation. Amanda Sterling stood in the doorway carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the conservative business attire of someone trying to rebuild a professional reputation. At 26, Amanda had aged considerably since the federal raids, her idealistic confidence tempered by the harsh realities of family betrayal and public scrutiny. Amanda, Hannah said warmly, crossing the room to embrace her former adversary turned ally. How are you holding? Better than expected, Amanda replied, though the strain in her voice suggested the adjustment hadn't been easy. The media attention has died down, and the threats from Uncle Richard's associates have stopped since his conviction was finalized. Richard Sterling had been sentenced to 25 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy, money laundering and obstruction of justice charges. The plea agreement had spared him a trial that could have resulted in life imprisonment, but it had also required him to forfeit personal assets worth over $200 million and cooperate with ongoing investigations into other financial institutions. Any regrets about testifying against your family? Hannah asked, as they settled into chairs that still bore price tags from the office furniture store. Amanda was quiet for a moment, considering the question that had haunted her for months. I regret that my family was involved in criminal activity. I regret that my testimony helped send my uncle and brother to prison, but I don't regret exposing the truth. Marcus Sterling had received a lighter sentence, 8 years in exchange for his cooperation with federal investigators. His testimony had helped prosecutors understand the full scope of the money laundering operations and identify other financial institutions that might be facilitating similar activity. But the young man who'd once lived off family wealth and connections now faced nearly a decade in federal prison, his privileged lifestyle replaced by the harsh realities of incarceration. Have you heard from him? Hannah asked. Marcus wrote me a letter last month, Amanda said, pulling out a folded piece of paper from her portfolio. He apologized for involving me in the family business without understanding what he was asking me to overlook. He said he was grateful that I had the courage he lacked. Hannah felt a pang of sympathy for Marcus, despite everything he'd put her through. His entitlement and insecurity had made him a willing participant in corruption, but he'd also been a young man trying to live up to impossible family expectations. Prison might be exactly what he needed to develop genuine character. What about the rest of your family? Aunt Patricia disowned me publicly, Amanda replied matter-of-factly. Cousin James stopped taking my call. The family friends who used to invite me to charity galas and country club events act like I don't exist, but honestly, Hannah, I don't miss any of it. I spent 25 years pretending to be someone I wasn't, trying to live up to a family name that turned out to be built on lies. Amanda opened her portfolio and pulled out a business plan that represented months of careful preparation. I'd like to formally apply to become your first employee. I know my family name is toxic in banking circles, but I have inside knowledge of how financial institutions hide compliance violations, and I'm committed to preventing what happened at Sterling Financial from happening anywhere else. Hannah reviewed the business plan, impressed by Amanda's thoroughness and strategic thinking. The young woman had used her forced exile from traditional banking to develop expertise in regulatory compliance and whistleblower protection, studying cases from other industries and developing methodologies for detecting institutional corruption. Amanda, I can't pay you what you'd make at a traditional bank, Hannah warned. This is a startup consulting firm with uncertain revenue and no corporate benefits package. I don't want traditional banking anymore, Amanda replied firmly. I want to work for someone who prioritizes integrity over profit margins, someone who wouldn't fire me for doing the right thing. Hannah smiled and extended her hand. Welcome to Caldwell Compliance Consulting. Their handshake was interrupted by a knock on the office door. David White entered, carrying an advance copy of his newly published book about the Sterling Financial case. Congratulations on the new office, he said, looking around the space that would soon house their expanded operations. I brought you something. The book was titled The Whistleblower's Gambit: How One Woman Exposed the Billion-Dollar Banking Conspiracy. Hannah's photograph graced the cover alongside images of the federal building where she'd testified and the Sterling Financial Tower where the corruption had flourished for years. "How does it feel to be famous?" David asked with a grin. "Terrifying," Hannah admitted, flipping through pages that detailed her transformation from institutional insider to federal witness. "I never wanted to be a public figure. I just wanted to prevent financial crime." "You've done more than prevent crime," David said seriously. "Your case has led to regulatory reforms, enhanced oversight procedures, and a dozen other investigations into banking compliance violations. The ripple effects are still spreading." Hannah had received recognition from federal agencies, reform advocacy groups, and professional associations, but the accolades felt hollow compared to the personal costs she'd endured. Her relationship with her sister had been strained by the media attention and security concerns. Her dating life was non-existent. Who wanted to romance someone whose story was plastered across newspapers and featured in television documentaries? Most difficult of all, she'd been forced to accept that she would never again work as a traditional banking compliance officer. "Speaking of ripple effects," David continued, "I have someone who wants to meet you." Jennifer Walsh entered the office, followed by an older woman Hannah didn't recognize. Jennifer's former Federal Reserve colleague had become Hannah's closest advisor during the transition from witness to entrepreneur, helping her navigate the complex world of regulatory consulting while building credibility with potential clients. "Hannah, I'd like you to meet Senator Patricia Walsh," Jennifer said, her expression suggesting this wasn't a social visit. Hannah felt her pulse quicken. Senator Walsh chaired the Senate Banking Committee and had been vocal about the need for regulatory reform following the Sterling Financial scandal. Her support could legitimize Hannah's consulting firm and provide access to clients throughout the financial industry. "Ms. Caldwell," Senator Walsh said, extending a firm handshake, "I've read your testimony before federal regulators and I'm impressed by your expertise in detecting compliance violations. I'd like to discuss a consulting opportunity." "What kind of opportunity?" "The Banking Committee is reviewing proposed mergers between several major financial institutions," the senator explained. "We need independent compliance experts to evaluate whether these banks are accurately representing their regulatory status. Your experience with the Sterling Financial case makes you uniquely qualified to identify potential problems before they become public scandals." Hannah felt the irony of the situation. 6 months ago, she'd been a mid-level compliance officer, whose concerns were dismissed by powerful executives. Now a U.S. senator was seeking her expertise to evaluate some of the largest financial institutions in the country. "Senator, I'm honored by your confidence, but I should mention that my consulting firm is still in its startup phase. We don't have the resources of major accounting firms or established regulatory consultancies." "That's exactly why I want to work with you," Senator Walsh replied. "The established firms are too invested in maintaining relationships with banking clients to provide truly independent analysis. I need someone who's proven they'll prioritize compliance over convenience." The meeting lasted 2 hours, during which Senator Walsh outlined a comprehensive review of pending banking mergers worth over $50 billion in combined value. Hannah's firm would be responsible for conducting independent compliance assessments, identifying potential regulatory violations, and providing recommendations to federal oversight agencies. "This contract would establish your firm's reputation in regulatory consulting," Jennifer observed after the senator left, "but it would also put you at the center of some very high-stakes political and economic decisions." "More enemies?" Hannah asked with weary humor. "More opportunities to prevent financial crime," Amanda corrected. "Isn't that why we're doing this?" Hannah walked to her window, looking out at the city where she'd spent her entire professional career. The financial district bustled with activity, bankers closing deals, regulators reviewing compliance filings, investigators pursuing leads that might uncover the next major scandal. Somewhere in those gleaming towers, other compliance officers were probably discovering suspicious activities and facing the same choice Hannah had confronted 6 months ago. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Ms. Caldwell, I'm a compliance officer at First National Bank. I've found evidence of suspicious account activity that reminds me of what you discovered at Sterling Financial. Can we meet? I'm scared to report this through normal channels." Hannah showed the message to Amanda and Jennifer, who exchanged meaningful glances. Their new consulting firm was already attracting exactly the kind of client they'd hoped to serve: institutional insiders who needed guidance and support for reporting compliance violations. "Are you ready for this?" Jennifer asked. "Because once word gets out that you're helping other whistleblowers, you're going to become a target for every corrupt institution in the financial industry." Hannah thought about her father's photograph, now sitting on her new desk beside copies of federal regulations and compliance manuals. James Caldwell had taught her that integrity wasn't about avoiding difficult choices, it was about making the right choice regardless of personal cost. "I've spent 6 months learning to live with the consequences of exposing corruption," Hannah said, typing a response to the unknown compliance officer. "I think I can handle whatever comes next." She scheduled a meeting with the First National Bank whistleblower for the following week, already mentally preparing for another investigation that might expose institutional corruption and protect innocent victims from financial crime. As the afternoon sun slanted through her office windows, Hannah reflected on the journey that had brought her from Sterling Financial's compliance department to this moment. She'd lost her career, her security, and her anonymity, but she'd gained something more valuable: the knowledge that individual courage could change entire systems. The Sterling Financial scandal had cost Richard Sterling his freedom, Marcus Sterling his future, and thousands of employees their jobs. But it had also prevented billions of dollars in additional money laundering activity, led to regulatory reforms that would protect other institutions, and inspired other compliance officers to report violations they might otherwise have ignored. Hannah Caldwell had wanted to honor her father's memory by preventing others from being victimized by financial fraud. She'd succeeded beyond her wildest expectations, and she was just getting started. The phone rang with another potential client, and Hannah smiled as she reached for the receiver. Her new life was beginning, built on the foundation of choices that had cost her everything she'd thought she wanted, but given her everything she'd never known she needed. Her father would have been proud. Amanda looked up from the business plan she was revising. "Hannah, do you think we can really make a difference? Can a small consulting firm actually change how the financial industry handles compliance?" Hannah considered the question while watching the sun set over the city where corruption and integrity waged their eternal battle. "Amanda, 6 months ago I was one person with evidence that nobody wanted to hear. Today we're a team of people dedicated to preventing financial crime, with the backing of federal legislators and the support of other compliance professionals who want to do the right thing." She gestured toward the growing stack of potential client inquiries on her desk. "I think we can make exactly as much difference as we're willing to fight for." As they worked late into the evening preparing for their first major consulting contract, Hannah felt the satisfaction that came from building something meaningful from the ashes of personal destruction. The Sterling Financial scandal had ended one chapter of her life, but it had also written the first page of a story that could help protect the financial system's integrity for years to come. The whistleblower's gambit had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams. Now came the harder task of turning that success into lasting change. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.